Hello, I'm SA, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
In the intellectual landscape of mid-20th century British philosophy, a landscape long settled by the grand, abstract systems of idealism, and more recently colonized by the Aristotelian of Bertrand Russell and the early Ludwig Wittgenstein, the work of Peter Geach arrived like a geological event. It was a seismic shift driven by a profound dissatisfaction with the dominant philosophical orthodoxies. His project began with a seemingly innocuous, almost pedantic, assertion that certain predicables are in fact names of materials. This simple claim, however, contained the seed of a revolution, a declaration that the world of tangible things of substances and kinds possessed a reality and a logical structure that the prevailing philosophies had either dissolved into a featureless whole or analyzed into logical oblivion. Geach's life's work would be a sustained campaign to restore substance to a world of shadows, using the most modern logical weapons to resurrect a deeply classical understanding of reality. His first intellectual adversary was the lingering influence of British idealism, the philosophical system personified by figures like F. H. Bradley. For the idealist, ultimate reality was a single, undifferentiated spiritual absolute. Individual objects, the chairs we sit on, the people we speak to, were mere appearances, their distinctness an illusion that dissolved upon deeper metaphysical inspection. Geach championed a philosophy of robust realism, a direct counterpoint to this monistic vision. He sought to reground philosophy in the common-sense conviction that the world consists of a plurality of real, distinct things. His ambition was to demonstrate that this conviction was philosophically defensible and logically coherent, a task that required him to confront the newer, more formidable power in British thought of the analytic philosophy pioneered by Bertrand Russell. Russell's legacy, particularly his theory of descriptions, had become the new orthodoxy. This theory proposed a powerful method for analyzing language, but at a steep metaphysical price. According to Russell's view, ordinary proper names, like Socrates or London, were logically equivalent to disguised definite descriptions. To speak of Socrates was to speak of the philosopher who taught Plato and drank hemlock. The individual, Socrates himself, disappeared from the logical picture, replaced by a bundle of properties. This elegant logical maneuver had the effect of dissolving concrete individuals into collections of attributes, a result Geach found metaphysically intolerable. It represented a fundamental confusion, a failure to honor the critical distinction articulated by the German logician Gottlob Frege. Frege had provided the essential logical tools for Geach's counter-reformation. His function and argument analysis of the sentence provided a rigorous model for understanding predication. For Frege, a concept or predicate, like is wise, is an unsaturated entity, a function awaiting an argument to become complete. A proper name referring to an object serves as that argument. When the name Socrates saturates the function is wise, the result is a complete thought with a truth value. This analysis preserves a clean and absolute distinction between the object itself and the concepts that apply to it. Geach perceived that Russell, in treating names as descriptions, had collapsed this vital distinction, effectively treating objects as if they were themselves complex concepts. Geach's project was to take up Frege's logical apparatus and deploy it to the service of a metaphysical realism inherited from Aristotle and, most significantly, from Thomas Aquinas. This fusion of medieval metaphysics with modern formal logic would become a hallmark of the intellectual movement. He and his wife, the formidable philosopher G.E.M. Anscombe, would forge a school of thought that came to be known as Analytic Thomism. His early publications served as initial, decisive engagements in this campaign. The 1950 paper Subject and Predicate was a direct assault on the Russellian synthesis. In it, Geach meticulously worked to reestablish the logical primacy of the referring name. He argued with force and precision that the role of a name is to pick out a thing in the world, while the role of a predicate is to say something about that thing. This reassertion of a fundamental logical division was the first step in dismantling the descriptivist program and rebuilding a philosophy where real-world substances could serve as the ultimate subjects of our discourse. This logical framework soon found a powerful application in his ethical thought. His 1956 paper Good and Evil stands as a landmark text, representing the first major offensive in what would become a lifelong battle against the non-cognitivist theories of ethics then in vogue. Philosophers like I had argued that moral statements were expressions of emotion, devoid of truth value. Geach's counter-argument was rooted in a subtle, yet powerful, logical distinction. He differentiated between predicative adjectives and attributive adjectives. An adjective like red is predicative. One can say that is a red book and abstract the property of redness to say the book is red. The property stands on its own. An adjective like good, however, is attributive. One can say that is a good knife, But the statement that is good is incomplete. Good is what? Its meaning is parasitic upon the noun it modifies. A good knife is one that cuts well. A good watch is one that keeps time accurately. Goodness, he argued, is inextricably linked to the kind of thing being described and its function or purpose. This Aristotelian and Thomistic idea that goodness relates to the flourishing or proper functioning of a specific nature was thus given a fresh and rigorous defense using the tools of modern logic. Morality was thereby rescued from the realm of mere feeling and re-anchored in the objective nature of things. The immediate impact of this early work was profound, creating a new center of gravity in British philosophy. His intellectual partnership with Anscombe was a crucible for these ideas, a lifelong collaboration that produced a coherent and formidable philosophical alternative. Furthermore, Geach's relentless critique of the dominant descriptivist theory of names cleared the ground for subsequent developments in the philosophy of language. By insisting that names must latch onto the world directly, he identified a central problem that the Russellian model was unable to solve. This created the intellectual space for the theories of direct reference that would emerge a generation later. Thinkers like Saul Kripke, in developing the concept of rigid designators, would build powerful new theories upon the very foundations of the problem that Geach had first so forcefully articulated. Geach's initial work had successfully challenged the philosophical establishment and re-established the logical and metaphysical priority of substances and kinds. He demonstrated that names could refer and that properties, including moral ones, were often dependent on the nature of the things they described. Yet this very success opened up a new and more complex field of inquiry. If reference is tied to kinds, how do general terms themselves, words like man or river, function logically within a sentence? How does language secure reference to the same object as it persists and changes through time? These questions demanded a more systematic and comprehensive treatment, a challenge Geach would address in his magnum opus, a work that would formalize his insights into a revolutionary theory of reference and identity. Geach's initial work had successfully challenged the philosophical establishment and re-established the logical and metaphysical priority of substances and kinds. He demonstrated that names could refer and that properties, including moral ones, were often dependent on the nature of the things they described. Yet this very success opened up a new and more complex field of inquiry. If reference is tied to kinds, how do general terms themselves, words like man or river, function logically within a sentence? How does language secure reference to the same object as it persists and changes through time? These questions demanded a more systematic and comprehensive treatment, a challenge Geach would address in his magnum opus, a work that would formalize his insights into a revolutionary theory of reference and identity. That work, Reference and Generality, published in 1962, stands as a monumental critique of the logical orthodoxy that had reigned for half a century. The prevailing model of quantification, developed by Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell, treated all general terms as predicates. In this view, a statement like "some man is wise" was analyzed by treating man and wise as logically symmetrical. The sentence was understood to mean, roughly, there exists an X such that X is a man and X is wise. Geach perceived profound inadequacies within this framework. It appeared elegant in its formal simplicity, but it achieved this elegance by flattening the rich structure of natural language and ignoring a crucial distinction. For Geach, a term like man and a term like wise perform fundamentally different logical jobs. This perception became the starting point for a complete reconstruction of the theory of reference. The genesis of this solution lay in a return to a pre-Phregian, and indeed ancient, source, Aristotle's logic of categories. Geach revived and formalized the distinction between what he called substantival terms and adjectival terms. A substantival term, like man, river, or planet, carries within its meaning a principle of identity. It tells you what it is to be one such thing and how to count such things. If you are asked to count the men in a room, the term man provides the criterion for distinguishing one from another. In contrast, an adjectival term, like red or heavy, provides no such principle. To count the reds in a room is an ambiguous instruction until one specifies what is to be counted: red books, red patches, or red atoms. The adjectival term presupposes the substantival term to give it a foothold in reality. This distinction, once articulated, seems elemental, yet its implications for formal logic were seismic. It meant that the Frege-Russell analysis, by treating man and red as logically parallel, was built on a fundamental error. From this foundation, Geach developed his most celebrated and contentious doctrine, the theory of relative identity. If a substantival term supplies the criterion of identity for the things it denotes, it follows that all identity is relative to such a term. The classical absolute conception of identity, expressed in the formula X is the same as Y, was for Geach an incomplete thought. He argued that any meaningful assertion of identity must take the form X is the same F as Y, where F is a substantival term. This move directly confronted a cornerstone of modern logic, Leibniz's law, which posits a single, universal relation of identity. Geach's favorite illustration of this principle was the ancient paradox of Heraclitus's river. One can step into the same river twice, even though the water composing it is completely different on each occasion. An analysis based on absolute identity creates a puzzle of the mass of water molecules at time 1 is distinct from the mass of water molecules at time 2. Therefore, the object is different. Geach's framework dissolves the paradox with ease. The collection of water at time 1 is a different collection of water from the one at time 2. However, it is the same river. Identity as a river is a different and less stringent relation than identity as a collection of molecules. An object can preserve its identity as an F while failing to preserve its identity as a G. This insight provided a powerful new tool for analyzing problems of persistence through change, from the ship of Theseus to the complex issue of personal identity. This logical apparatus had immediate applications in the philosophy of language, particularly in his analysis of pronouns. Geach dismantled the prevailing view of pronouns as mere pronouns of laziness, placeholders that simply stand in for a repeated noun phrase. He argued that pronouns in many contexts function as bound variables akin to the variables used in formal logic. In a sentence like "any man who owns a donkey beats it," the pronoun does its work by being bound by the quantifier phrase "a donkey." It refers back, creating a cross-referential link that the older theories were powerless to explain. This analysis integrated the study of natural language grammar with the resources of modern predicate calculus in a way that was genuinely pioneering, forcing linguists and logicians to reconsider the deep structure of ordinary sentences. The intellectual lineage of reference and generality is clear. Geach took W.V.O. Quine's famous dictum, "no entity without identity," and turned it into a weapon against Quine's own extensionalist ontology. Quine demanded that our theories be clear about what they quantify over, but Geach pressed the point further: a theory can only be clear about what it quantifies over if its general terms supply definite criteria of identity for those entities. Geach's work was thus an attempt to provide the metaphysical and logical grounding that he found absent in Quine's system. The reception of Geach's work was profound and lasting. It became an unavoidable touchstone for subsequent work in metaphysics and the philosophy of language. The philosopher David Wiggins, in his landmark book Sameness and Substance, produced what is essentially a book-length dialogue with Geach. Wiggins accepted Geach's core insight that identity is tied to sortal kinds, but he refined the theory, arguing that for any object, there is one dominant sortal that provides its principle of absolute identity over time. This engagement demonstrates the generative power of Geach's framework, capable of supporting sophisticated new research programs even among those who sought to amend it. Similarly, the neo-Fregean philosophy of Crispin Wright, which attempts to ground mathematics in logic, must constantly grapple with the Geach-Frege point about the criteria required for concept to successfully refer to abstract objects. The questions Geach raised about identity criteria remain at the very center of contemporary debates. His logical framework provided a robust, enduring, and deeply Aristotelian alternative to the dominant model theoretic semantics of the 20th century. Having forged these powerful logical tools, Geach was prepared to deploy them in other domains, turning his attention to the very structure of human action, virtue, and thought itself. His logical framework provided a robust, enduring, and deeply Aristotelian alternative to the dominant model theoretic semantics of the 20th century. Having forged these powerful logical tools, Geach was prepared to deploy them in other domains, turning his attention to the very structure of human action, virtue, and thought itself. He perceived a profound philosophical disorder in the modern understanding of ethics and the mind, and he believed his analytic instruments were precisely what was needed to restore clarity and coherence. The ethical landscape Geach entered was dominated by theories he considered intellectually bankrupt. The prevailing winds of emotivism and prescriptivism, stemming from the logical positivist movement, had reduced moral statements to mere expressions of feeling or disguised commands. On this view, the declaration that cruelty is wrong was functionally equivalent to shouting boo to cruelty. This stripped moral discourse of its claim to rationality and truth, a conclusion Geach found both philosophically untenable and culturally corrosive. He sought to dismantle this non-cognitivist consensus from the ground up, aiming to reestablish ethics as an objective and rational domain of inquiry. His method was to apply the same rigorous semantic analysis that had served him so well in logic. His solution was a powerful revival of virtue ethics, drawing its philosophical lifeblood from Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. The linchpin of his entire ethical project was his analysis of the word good. Geach argued persuasively that good is an attributive adjective, meaning its sense is always dependent on the noun it modifies. A good knife is one that cuts well. A good watch is one that keeps time accurately. Its goodness is determined by its function, its purpose, its telos. From this logical point, he made a seamless move to ethics. To understand what a good human is, one must first understand the distinctive function of a human being. Following his classical predecessors, Geach identified this function with the exercise of reason. A good human, therefore, is one who lives and acts in accordance with reason, cultivating the virtues that allow for human flourishing. Morality becomes an objective matter, grounded in the facts of human nature. This teleological framework was buttressed by one of the most formidable technical arguments in all of matter ethics, what has since become known as the Frege-Geach problem. It is a devastating logical challenge aimed directly at the heart of expressivist and other non-cognitivist theories. Geach observed that moral terms appear in many linguistic contexts. Sometimes they are used to make a direct assertion, as in the sentence lying is wrong. An expressivist might claim the sentence's meaning is exhausted by its use to express disapproval of lying. Geach then pointed to more complex sentences, such as the conditional if lying is wrong, and telling your brother to lie is wrong. Within the clause of this statement, the phrase lying is wrong is entertained without being asserted. The speaker is exploring a logical connection, a world of possibility, without actively condemning lying at that moment. For the overall argument to be valid, the word wrong must mean the same thing in both its asserted and unasserted occurrences. The Frege-Geach problem exposes the immense difficulty expressivist theories have in providing a unified account of meaning that works in both contexts. This single argument remains a central and persistent obstacle for all modern forms of non-cognitivism. Geach's positive ethical vision received its fullest expression in his 1977 book, The Virtues. Here, he provided detailed analyses of the cardinal and theological virtues, always through the lens of rational human functioning. His treatment of courage, for instance, moves far beyond a simple feeling of fearlessness. For Geach, courage is the rational mastery of fear in pursuit of a worthy and intelligible end. It is a virtue because it enables a person to act rightly and achieve good outcomes even in the face of danger or pain. This Aristotelian conception integrates reason, action, and purpose, presenting a stark contrast to ethical theories that focus on consequences alone or on abstract duties detached from a conception of the good life. The direct intellectual lineage from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Aquinas' Summa Theologica is unmistakable. Yet the arguments are sharpened and defended with the precision tools of modern analytic philosophy. A parallel campaign was waged in the philosophy of mind against the enduring legacy of Cartesianism. Geach targeted the pervasive tendency to picture the mind as a sort of inner theater, where a self or ego observes passing thoughts, beliefs, and sensations. He especially opposed the common philosophical model of judgment, which treated it as a two-place relation between a mind and an abstract entity called a proposition. In a seminal work, Mental Acts, Geach argued that this picture fundamentally misrepresents the nature of thought. Influenced by Wittgenstein's private language argument, he insisted that mental concepts must have public, logical criteria for their application. His alternative was a sophisticated act-object analysis. A judgment, for Geach, is an irreducible, complex psychological act. When someone judges that the cat is on the mat, there are three distinct components of the mind doing the judging: the act of judging itself and the content of the judgment. The key insight is that the act of judging is a single, unified reality. It is an act of judging that the cat is on the mat. It is a whole psychological event, a complex verb whose internal structure is logical. This view solves the Cartesian problem of how a mind connects to an abstract proposition by refusing to separate them in the first place. The content is internal to the act itself, much like the idea of a destination is internal to the act of traveling. The cumulative effect of these projects in ethics and the philosophy of mind was profound. Geach's work, alongside that of his close friend and collaborator Elizabeth Anscombe, was instrumental in the late 20th century revival of virtue ethics. Philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre, in his landmark book After Virtue, explicitly built upon the foundations they laid, continuing the project of diagnosing the failures of modern moral philosophy and seeking a return to a more coherent, teleological framework. Similarly, the ethical naturalism of Philipper Foot runs on a parallel track, developing a conception of morality grounded in the objective facts of human flourishing. In each case, the influence of Geach's analytic rigor and his insistence on the functional nature of good are clearly visible. His work demonstrated that a philosophy could be at once deeply traditional in its conclusions and radically modern in its methods. The ultimate grounding for his teleological view of human purpose, however, lay in a domain that many of his analytic contemporaries had abandoned entirely: the rigorous metaphysics of classical theism. This grounding in classical theism was for Geach a matter of supreme philosophical importance, a domain where the full power of modern logic could be brought to bear on the most ancient of questions. In the mid-20th century, a wide chasm seemed to separate the world of analytic philosophy from the intricate metaphysical architecture of scholastic thought. The prevailing view among many of Geach's contemporaries was that the doctrines of classical theism, particularly the complex system of Thomas Aquinas, were artifacts of a pre-scientific age, their language too vague, and their concepts too obscure for rigorous logical analysis. They were seen as relics, interesting perhaps for historical study, yet fundamentally incompatible with the precision demanded by the new logic of Frege and Russell. Geach perceived this situation as a profound intellectual error. He saw the alleged incompatibility as a failure of imagination on the part of the analytic school. He embarked on a project to demonstrate that modern logical methods were the ideal instruments for clarifying, defending, and illuminating the core tenets of orthodox Christian doctrine. This endeavor would make him a principal architect of the movement that came to be known as Analytic Thomism, a rigorous fusion of medieval metaphysics with contemporary logical technique. His work sought to show that the central claims of theism were coherent, philosophically defensible, and accessible to the sharpest tools of reason. His books, especially God and the Soul from 1969 and Providence and Evil from 1977, serve as primary testaments to this project. In them, Geach confronts foundational theological concepts, stripping away centuries of what he considered pious confusion to reveal a logically sound core. A prime example is his treatment of divine simplicity. For many, this doctrine appeared to be a piece of mystical abstraction. Geach re-engineered it as a conclusion of strict logical entailment. His primary influence here was Aquinas, whose concept of God as actus purus, or pure actuality, provided the starting point. Geach argued that a being in a state of pure actuality has no unactualized potentials. A thing with no potential for change or division is, by definition, without composition. It lacks parts. From this premise, it follows that for such a being, its essence is identical to its existence. This was a powerful translation of the classical metaphysical argument into a language that analytic philosophers were compelled to engage with. Perhaps the most audacious application of his logical innovation was his defense of the doctrine of the Trinity. For centuries, this concept had been presented as a mystery that defied rational comprehension, a truth to be accepted through faith alone. Geach, however, saw it as a challenge of logical grammar. He deployed his theory of relative identity to show the doctrine's internal coherence. He argued that any statement of identity is incomplete without a covering noun or subtle term. One must always ask, the same what? Applying this, he proposed a now famous formulation: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are the same God, while being distinct persons. The identity holds under the covering concept God, and the distinction holds under the covering concept person. This move, while controversial, shifted the entire debate. It transformed the Trinity from a supposed logical contradiction into a complex, yet formally articulatable, proposition. The question became one of accepting the metaphysical framework, a framework Geach argued was perfectly coherent. This same commitment to logical clarity shaped his treatment of divine attributes. Confronting the paradoxes of omnipotence, Geach offered a definition that remains influential. He defined God's power as the ability to perform any action that is logically possible to describe. The capacity to create a round square, for instance, is excluded. A logical contradiction describes no state of affairs and therefore presents nothing to be done, even for an infinite being. This careful delineation of omnipotence, profoundly influenced by Aquinas, resolved a host of apparent problems and provided a more defensible model for theological discourse. He was in constant, albeit implicit, dialogue with his skeptical contemporaries, figures such as Anthony Flew and J. L. Mackie, whose critiques of theism often hinged on precisely these kinds of supposed logical incoherencies. Geach's work was a direct response, aiming to pull the rug out from under their objections by showing the internal consistency of the classical view. His analysis of the problem of evil in providence and evil was similarly rigorous and, for many, deeply unsettling. He found the popular free will defense, which locates the source of evil in the choices of created beings, to be philosophically inadequate. Geach instead advanced a starker, more challenging theodicy rooted in the absolute sovereignty of God. He argued for a creator whose all-encompassing plan is inscrutable to finite minds. From the human perspective, the world contains immense suffering and horror. From the divine perspective, this same world is part of a providential order that is, in its totality, perfectly good. For Geach, the existence of evil challenges human understanding, compelling a trust in a divine wisdom whose purposes transcend our ability to fully grasp them. This position, while alienating to some, was for him the only one consistent with a robust conception of divine providence as articulated by Aquinas in the Summa Theologica. The impact of this work was transformative. Geach almost single-handedly established the standards of logical rigor for the modern discipline of analytic philosophy of religion. He created the intellectual environment in which a new generation of theistic philosophers could operate. Alden Plantinga, for example, while developing his own celebrated version of the free will defense, was working within a field whose terms of engagement had been profoundly shaped by Geach's logical precision. The very expectation that theological claims must withstand the scrutiny of modal logic owes a great deal to Geach's pioneering efforts. Furthermore, scholars like Elamar Stump and Brian Davies would become central figures in the ongoing revival of Thomistic thought. built their own formidable contributions upon the methodological foundation he had laid. He inaugurated the Analytic Thomistic research program, a vibrant and ongoing school of thought demonstrating the enduring intellectual power of Aquinas' vision when articulated with contemporary analytic tools. Geach made it possible to be a Thomist in the 20th century without apology. His intellectual persona, however, was as distinctive as his arguments and often a source of considerable friction. The final part will analyze Geach's famously polemical style and conclude with a powerful synthesis of his enduring, unified philosophical legacy. His intellectual persona, however, was as distinctive as his arguments and often a source of considerable friction. This was a famous, or infamous, Cambridge Polish, a style of engagement that possessed little to do with smooth veneer and everything to do with abrasive intellectual honesty. Geach's manner in debate and in print was combative, frequently dismissive, and occasionally ferocious. This approach was far from a mere personal quirk or an unfortunate character flaw. It is a direct and necessary consequence of his core philosophical convictions. For Geach, philosophy was a serious, objective discipline aimed at truth. Consequently, a logical error, a muddled concept, or a piece of fashionable sophistry represented a genuine corruption, a dangerous falsehood that threatened the integrity of the intellectual enterprise itself. He treated a fallacy with the same urgency a physician treats a pathogen. His argumentative method was therefore a form of intellectual combat. He believed that unclear ideas and invalid arguments needed to be exposed and defeated, swiftly and publicly. His book reviews were legendary for their surgical and often brutal clarity. He would dismantle an opponent's thesis with the same dispassionate precision he applied to a logical formula, revealing the flawed premises and faulty inferences with an air of profound impatience for the time wasted on such confusion. His many documented interventions at philosophical lectures followed a similar pattern. He would rise to challenge a speaker, his questions cutting directly to the weakest point of their presentation, his demeanor communicating that the matter at hand was of the utmost gravity. These were performances, in a sense, but they were performances of a deeply held belief that philosophy is a live, adversarial practice, where truth is forged in the crucible of rigorous, unsparing criticism. Perhaps the most masterful exhibition of this combative intellect lies in his framing of a central problem in metaethics. He christened it the Frege problem, a brilliant rhetorical maneuver that permanently shaped the landscape of the debate. The problem targets non-cognitivism, the view that ethical sentences like tormenting the innocent is wrong do something other than state a fact. Perhaps they express an emotion or issue a command. Geach, following Frege's insights and meaning, pointed out a severe difficulty. The non-cognitivist account seems to work for a simple assertion, but what happens when that same phrase is embedded within a more complex logical structure? For instance, a conditional statement like, if tormenting the innocent is wrong, then you should get your brother to stop doing it. In this context, the phrase tormenting the innocent is wrong is part of an antecedent. It is being supposed, its meaning considered, without being asserted. The speaker is certainly expressing an emotion or issuing a command. The meaning of the phrase appears to shift, losing its special non-cognitive force. Yet, for the overall argument to be valid, the meaning of the phrase must remain constant across both its asserted and its unasserted uses. This is the embedding problem. The non-cognitivist, Geach argued, is unable to provide a coherent account of how moral language functions within the ordinary logical connectives that structure our reasoning. By naming this the Frege problem, he implicitly cloaked his critique in the unassailable authority of the founder of modern logic, while simultaneously forcing his opponents to engage with a dilemma on his terms. It was a strategic masterstroke, cementing a major challenge to an entire school of ethical theory. To assess Peter Geach's final place in the philosophical canon is to recognize the profound and unwavering unity of his life's work. His entire intellectual output constitutes a single, monumental, and integrated project. He sought nothing less than the systematic reconstruction of a realist, teleological, and theistic worldview using the most sophisticated and powerful tools of modern analytical logic. His explorations of relative identity, his defense of substance, his analysis of predication, his arguments for virtue, and his philosophical theology were interconnected components of this grand synthesis. Each piece of his philosophy reinforces the others, forming a coherent and formidable intellectual structure. His work on identity provided the metaphysical foundation for a stable world of things. His logic of predication supplied the tools to speak truly about those things and their properties. His ethics grounded human action in the flourishing of a particular kind of being, man, whose nature could be understood. And his theology posited a rational, absolute creator as the ultimate source and end of this intelligible order. Geach's fundamental achievement was to demonstrate, through sheer force of argument, that one could be a thoroughly modern logician without surrendering the deep metaphysical questions of the classical and medieval traditions. He refused the dominant narrative that the logical innovations of Frege and Russell necessitated a rejection of Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics. Instead, he seized those very innovations and turned them into instruments for refining, defending and advancing that older tradition. He showed that a commitment to logical rigor was wholly compatible with a belief in substances, virtues, and God. He made it possible to speak a teleology with the precision of predicate calculus and to defend the divine attributes with the clarity of modal logic. He therefore stands as a permanent and powerful rebuke to the fragmentation that characterizes so much of contemporary philosophy. In an age of increasing specialization, where logicians rarely speak to metaphysicians and ethicists rarely engage with theologians, Geach's work is a testament to the possibility of a truly systematic intellectual life. He saw philosophy as a whole, a unified quest for truth about the total structure of reality, from the logic of the simple name to the nature of the absolute being. His legacy is the enduring power of this vision. He was a logician's logician, a metaphysician's metaphysician, and a philosopher's philosopher, a figure whose immense body of work continues to challenge, provoke, and inspire anyone who believes that the aim of philosophy is and always must be to understand everything.
We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.